everyone. It is episode 416 of This Is Whole Life. It is Tuesday. It feels like normal, except there's a special guest in the studio. But before we get to that, if you are unfamiliar, if you are new, This Is Whole Life. We dig deeper into the message and the things being discussed here at Whole Life Church in Orlando, Florida. We do this every week, every Wednesday morning. And in part of this, we would love to have, part of this includes your input. And so if you haven't joined us online during the chat while service is going on every Saturday morning at 9:30 and 12, which is where many of our questions come from and from people actually in attendance, you can send an email or voicemail or text message, 407-965-1607 or podcast at wholelife.church. So let your voice be heard. Now, the person that is sitting across from me, because as always, Ken is to my right.
On your right hand?
Always on my right hand, just where he's supposed to be. Melanie is off to the left, over there in the corner.
With the goats.
Correct.
Greatest of all time is what I meant.
No,
sure.
Dr. Bachman, we presume. I love saying that so much. I really do. I mean, probably not as much as you enjoy hearing it and even more so feeling it. It's over.
It is over.
It's over.
Yes.
Oh, well, last time I asked Ken to introduce our special guest. So being that you were kind of along for the ride on this one, why don't you, Melanie, take over and introduce our special guest?
All right. Well, to my left, introducing artiste Stanley Pomianowski, also known as director, writer, producer, filmmaker.
Oh, yes.
Extraordinaire.
Oh, yes. Extraordinaire.
I feel like there needs to be applause.
I know. Can you add applause in post? Or?
I should have. You know, the only
That's my own applause.
The only thing missing this week, and I'm going to have to say I'm a little disappointed. I don't want to be calling anybody out by name here, Carolina Dave, but I was really
He was spending time with me.
Yeah, was he?
Yeah, I have pictures.
Shut up.
What?
Carolina Dave, I'm out of the loop here.
You guys didn't like call in and do a voicemail for
You
us?
thought I was going to my son's graduation. I was just going to go spend time with Carolina
Dave. Man,
No.
I'm telling you, you did get a chance?
He lives up there. Yeah, I did. I literally saw him, and actually, he would sure appreciate our prayers. He's got an important medical appointment today when you're listening to it,
On
Wednesday.
Okay.
So I know he'd appreciate all of our prayers. So keep him in prayer for that. That'd be great. But yeah, I saw him while I was up there.
Nice. If you have a moment, just press pause, say a little prayer, and then come back. And we will take care of that ourselves afterwards.
Welcome back.
So that's right. So welcome back on the show. All right. So we started off this series, which is the art of worship, and we started off with drama. We then went to music, and Stanley turned visual arts really into Filmology 101. It's kind of what I felt.
I took everybody to film school for a little bit.
And honestly, I mean, the response that we were getting online from, now everyone of y'all that are listening that attend our chat every week, you attend services online with us as the Whole Life family. You already know Stanley because he's been the online worship host almost by himself for a while. And the longest, starting way back for those of you that remember the loop. And so, you see Stanley up front with the Q&A afterwards and welcoming you to church. And so, and of course, he's no stranger here. What, tell everyone a little bit about how you came to and how long it's been since you've been first came to Whole Life Church, and it wasn't even Whole Life Church.
Sure, it wasn't Whole Life Church. So I graduated in college in 2005 and got married the next day, and on our honeymoon, we came to Orlando, and my wife got a job interview. So that's where we moved.
That sounds like a movie, Honeymoon in Orlando.
Honeymoon in Orlando. And
that's your next script, and I get 5%.
You're welcome.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. No, so my wife got a job down here, and I was like, well, I guess I need to find a job. And everybody said, at that time it was called Florida Hospital Church, but they said, oh, you got to get with Whole Life Church. And I'll just use our current name just because that's what it is now in my head. You got to get with them because there's this guy, Jeff Sincamani, who's just like really into video. So I came here and interviewed with Jeff, and that's a whole other story. That's kind of a little bit comical. I don't know if we have time for, but just my first couple of days with Jeff were a lot of fun, and and worked here for 3.5 years. Then worked at Advent Health, which was a different name back then too, Florida Hospital. Worked for them for 6.5 years, and then started my own business. And I'm about 6 years into that was when I picked up a contract here during COVID, when I nearly went out of business, and Whole Life Church needed a lot of video because nobody was meeting in person. So it was a match made in heaven.
That's crazy. So I was thinking to myself, like, I worked with Stanley for quite a few years. And so I was thinking to myself, when I first found out you were going to be having the message, and I was like, man, I wonder where Stanley's going to go with this. And I immediately was like, okay, I am ready, because, and I will say that I was just briefly disappointed. I mean, not on, not totally.
Wow.
Like,
I knew somebody would be disappointed.
But I mean, Stanley.
Yes.
Now you're going to hate me for this, but if there was ever a moment that your lightsaber should have come out on stage as a prop for something in this message, I was like, because I kept thinking to myself, they're keeping it a secret. Even Melanie's not telling me, and I am waiting for you to go back behind the drum kit and be like,
well, you know what the problem is that I actually broke my lightsaber from just playing with it and then trying to replace the battery and all this stuff. And
no, hang on, you broke it playing with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, just swinging it around too much, and
I remember the day.
Not your children broke it.
Me. Oh, I have it at my office.
No.
I think a better story is that you faced off with a villain.
Yeah.
Batteries were fine.
Late at night.
Well, I mean, that's part of it. That's how you break it. Is just someone else with a lightsaber comes into your office and you have to face off against them. But I did actually have Star Wars in my first draft. Like, Star Wars was like a big part. I actually consider myself more of a writer when it comes to filmmaking than any other part. And so my first draft of the sermon was actually about story and about how Jesus used story in the same way that Hollywood uses it, the same formula. And then Melanie was like, hey, the title of this is visual art, right? And I'm like, oh. And so, just redrafted and tapped into a little bit of that more visual side of filmmaking. So so what I don't want you to hear is that I'm going to preach another sermon because I think this is it. This is it for me.
I tried to schedule him for this coming week, Ken, to talk about architecture, but
I have somebody that I'm waiting on to do the final sermon in our Voices of Whole Life series. And if they tell me no, Stanley, you're up.
Oh no.
Yeah, and I think I think the topic that week is story.
Star Wars.
Is story?
Star Wars. Star Wars.
Now, if you're the person I asked to do this, do not feel any pressure. This is not really what it is, but please, for Stanley,
I will feel. You please feel the pressure to do it. No, I'm a behind the scenes type of person, and I appreciated the opportunity. Definitely, I was very nervous, and I think if you were at first service, you could probably tell a little bit more than at second service. But
I watched second service, and I thought you seemed pretty calm, cool, and collected.
Cool. It's weird because there's more people, so I should be more nervous, but it's just, once you do it, you're like, oh, well, I guess that wasn't so bad. I mean,
the funny thing for me is I feel less nervous with more people than I do with less people. Like, the bigger the crowd, the less nervous I personally feel. And I don't know if that's just because
you almost can't focus on someone.
Yeah, maybe
I think it's less personal.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
Yeah.
You can hide in a crowd better.
Like, the worst is just preaching to Melanie. There's a lot of judgment.
That's right. Ken really looks forward to Fridays.
For those of you that don't know, there's a practice that we go through, and it's just Melanie in the audience, and it's like a question of like, well, how much eye contact should I give Melanie? Is it
can get
the
a little awkward sometimes, until you establish what the right amount is. So
it's like, Just stare at Melanie the whole time, like, Melanie, this is the message. Like,
I really feel like this is a message you need to hear. Go ahead and quit critiquing it and just think about what God's trying to say to you here.
Just take it in.
Oh man, that's man. Is it that tough of a crowd? Really? I mean, do you?
No. I don't think so, but I've never stood in front of myself, so I don't really know.
I mainly just tried to avoid eye contact, honestly, of like, I feel like it'd be weird if I just stared at Melanie the whole time, but no, every time she looked very supportive, like, yes.
So I'll tell you a little secret here, Stanley, since Melanie can't hear what we're saying. I only look at her when I want her to get a point that I'm trying to make to her.
Oh, wow.
Specifically, so.
Well, now I know.
Wow.
I'm going to be watching for that eye contact.
Man, you're gonna have to be careful. Amazon came today,
Okay.
and that box was heavy.
Oh, yes.
And there were 2 books in there. She's about to get way more smarter. Yeah,
They're way more smarter.
She buy you a book of syntax and grammar?
she did. It's
wow.
What was the?
Or is
It's
you and I can share it?
It's pseudo something.
It's volume 1 and 2
This
of
is
the
riveting.
Old Testament pseudepigrapha. That's the apocryphal literature.
Some
these books-
light afternoon reading. It
Yeah.
sounds
I
like.
mean, I just about broke my back getting them off the counter where they were delivered. And then when I opened the book, these books are like, 5 inches thick, and you open it up and the writing, it's like, ooh, it's bifocal. Ooh, man, maybe I need a new set of glasses. That's how small the print is. So I can only imagine all of the good...
And Melanie said, "Oh, that's just Tuesday afternoon."
I know, right? She's like, I'll have this done in no time. So be careful. She's about to just, put it together even more, and that's scary. That's
You
really
ready
scary.
for the sermon series, the apocryphal sermon series?
That's right.
Sweet.
We're
Yeah.
doing one of those this year?
Not this year.
Oh, you're not going to be ready? I thought
It isn't really Tuesday afternoon. It's
No.
2024, really. Preparation.
Well, to me, Stanley's message was just an afternoon with Stanley, like normal storytelling. And no matter, I found early on that no matter what question you ask something of Stanley, unless it's just super mundane, and even then, Stanley can usually, because I think it's just his natural gift, turn it into a story. He can find some way to turn it into a story. So I felt like what you were talking about, like for me, it was just like, oh, it's... Stanley and I have had these conversations before,
Yeah.
maybe not exactly about this subject,
Yeah.
but the storytelling part, I think, is what really had people listening, because it's a gift that you have to do that. Like you said, you mentioned that you would in the whole process, like writing is what you identify most as
for
maybe
sure.
your expertise or.
Well, the one that got cut was about how I consider myself more a story collector sometimes than a storyteller, because I feel like a lot of people, like on a film set, can be a high stress situation, and a lot of people were saying, "You're so calm," and it's because in a way I'm almost like looking forward to a weird thing that happens or like a negative thing that happens, because it's like, oh man, this is going to make an interesting story. Or sometimes I'm like, I can't wait to tell this, and people are like, you're crazy, and I'm like, that's fine.
It's part of the story.
Part of the story.
Well, there aren't many crazier stories, which I had heard this story before. And so I was a little worried it was going to come off flat for me because I'd heard it before. Because I remember you telling me this story at your studio after it happened about the whole badge situation out in LA. And I mean, and I wasn't there this week. It was, my parents were leaving after the whole graduation festivities, and I was taking them to the airport, but I was trying to watch online as it was going through, and even some of the shots that I could see of the service, and you could see people's heads just like up and down, and then of course the laughter as these guys were like, "Hey, wait a minute, you don't look anything."
Yeah, you look nothing like this guy. And it was just when I actually use that story as like an icebreaker with everyone else I met at that market. And the greatest thing is that everybody knew that guy. Like,
what a gift though.
Yeah. And it was just a great icebreaker. And maybe that's part of why I consider myself that story collector, because I think stories connect and bond us together. And it was even better that it really delighted me that they knew who this guy was, and it made it funnier to them. And they were all like, "Oh man, this guy, we know. I have a picture of him at Cannes, the Cannes Film Festival, and he was asleep, and he's blah blah on the floor in the middle of what this or that." And I'm like, who is this guy? Like this guy's a story like maker, if you will, like story creator. Like he's the one generating these stories out there. But just using story to break in was just super useful because I'm an actual introvert, if you can't believe it. But trying to go out somewhere where I know absolutely no one and try to break the ice and try to sell them something is a little bit daunting for me. And maybe a lot of people can relate to that, but having a story in my back pocket that they could all relate to was so helpful. And that's where I think story is powerful.
Well, I think it's every week the message in some way and in some part is a story, whether it contains a story, but it kind of itself becomes a story. And then it becomes the spoken word in a container that can be digested. And then, we do a second podcast where we talk more about it, and there's stories that come out. And that's usually, and I think you're right in that a lot of the time, the response that we get from episodes that people really enjoy is, oh man, that's the story that Ken shared or Melanie shared or that Randy shared or the guest shared really resonated with me for whatever reason. And so I think that the storytelling part is really good and powerful, maybe more so than we typically give it credit for. But the jump from like introducing and kind of going through this storyteller telling this story, and it wasn't long after that you said, and I dare to say God is a filmmaker. And I'm like, it seemed like, now maybe it was just me, but I felt a little pause in my head, like people like, wait, what? God is a filmmaker. Where did, and I probably can't lay it out better than you, because this is your vision for what you were talking about. And the clips, like if you haven't seen the message, none of this is going to make a ton of sense if you don't go back and watch some of the setup that Stanley used, some pictures, like, one of my favorite movies.
Catch Me If You Can.
Catch Me If You Can. That's just a
great film.
That's just a classic. I love that movie. And I forget what was the other one that you had on screen when you were showing the different?
I had a couple of other examples. One was
Ferris Bueller.
Ferris Bueller was one that struck a chord. And then there's a shot from The Departed where I showed how director Martin Scorsese used light to show who a character was before you met them, and or as you met them, really. And I think those are the only stills I had was those three films. But in Second Service, I referenced X-Men at one point. So.
Well, but the thing I liked about that was the progression that you took. All the comments. You and I have talked about this, and you've given me this insight through some other podcasts that we've worked on, and just talking shop with people as they came into the studio. But the way that you laid it out, you have to see the message and kind of follow that progression for that part of it to make sense. But all the subtleties, and I think that's the part where a lot of times it's like, well, I'm gonna read my Bible and I'm gonna ponder what it says. I'm gonna think about it.
Or even just say, this is too confusing. I don't understand it. Yeah.
But this puts it down into, at least for someone that may use that side of their brain and see those visuals and have that, Anderline mentioned in staff meeting this morning about, for all the visual learners, a lot of people really took to heart some of the concepts that you were talking about. And did this feel like weird for you to break it down this way? Had you done this before? Like this was, Melanie said visual. Oh, I totally know where I'm going with this.
Well, because film is such a visual medium, it's a very strong part of the emphasis of film school. And using the term mise en scène, was like, oh, okay, cool. When you look at the masters, that's really started with this, with filmmaking, like Alfred Hitchcock. When they were in a studio, they had to use placement because they were always in a studio. They didn't always have a great on-location site, so they were limited in what they could shoot. So they were trying to block things so that it meant more, and it just kind of developed from there. And so when it came down to, oh, okay, you want me to talk about visual? I can do that, because that film school is all about the visual, really. And really, it was a fun exercise to dive deep into Revelation 4, because I just was like, I don't want to go with ones that are scary. I just wanted to go with one that was maybe one you hadn't heard before. I didn't want to talk about the beast, and I didn't want to get it. I just wanted to say, here's the setup to a scene. Before the scene even happens, let's figure out what's going on. It's kind of like, it was purely visual. I actually cut, there is one sentence that someone says in verse 1 that's like, come on up here, or whatever, something like that. But I just cut it just because I was like, let's focus purely on the visual. And before anything's even said in this chapter, let's try to figure out like what's going on. And I think most people talk to me about how much they appreciated the stills from Catch Me If You Can, and the idea of showing where the frames were. That was something that kind of I want to say blew my mind when I was in film school, of like, whoa, like that is really cool. And I have used that clip before in a film class that I have taught before, in like a brief overview of film, of just because I think it's like the strongest, fastest example of what mise en scène can really look like.
Well, I found it was interesting that just even if it doesn't necessarily answer any groundbreaking questions like, oh, I've always wanted to know this, and all I had to do was look at it like a filmmaker, but at the same time, it added a real depth to thinking about that text and saying, wow, if you look at it from this, okay, let's back up. Let's look at it from this one. Okay, now we're going to go back to this. Okay, now this is happening. And walking through that piece was really, really interesting. And my mind, I was even driving and I'm thinking to myself, okay, pay attention also, because
the road.
I was really starting to think. I had it kind of launched up there in the dash, which probably wasn't a smart idea, but just listening to that part of it really gave that people ask all the time, how can you change up your routine? How can you get out of the rut? How can you find Jesus in a different way? And I was like, wow, this is a perfect example of, and this is why I think the small communities here that we're working on and we launched recently and will continue to, foster and encourage.
Let me plug real quick. I started a group, Film Friends. So
there you go.
If you want to watch movies and talk about them, come sign up on wholelife.church/communities. Come join my group.
Mise en
scène, just mise en friends.
Wow!
But just film friends,
I sneeze on friends.
I know speak of that language. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
but I think that's the one of the examples of us being able to use what we know and what our passions are, and sharing that. And so I really felt like that. And I think you mentioned that you were starting the small community, but I really felt like it answers a question that a lot of times we expect God to speak like verbally and audibly and create some kind of an experience for us that we know it's God. When in fact, if you're friends with Stanley and you talk about things like this, and I know you and I have had some of those discussions about how does the secular versus the holy and all of this kind of thing, but how much there is just simple like lighting, like when you were talking about the blocking on Jack Nicholson, where it was like 4 minutes he's in this shot and not once did they throw light on this guy, and they let that foster your thoughts to do this. And then it makes me it really makes you stop and think, what do I put into my psyche that I don't even realize?
Yeah.
And sometimes my family hates watching movies with me because I'll be like, oh, that shot didn't work. Like that was daytime over here. Now it's not the right shot, not the right camera angle. They had to go back and fix it or something. And they're like, would you stop overanalyzing it? But at the same time, this just proves that sometimes thinking along those lines really can make an experience much richer. And so I just really, really appreciated how that the way you moved through that whole scene, and it like follow me
Yeah.
I'm going to take you on this little trip. And
zooming out of the starting close up and not Genesis, Revelation 4 of, starting on person sitting on the throne all the way to the point where you see 24 people around them and they're sitting on a lake and they're,
that's like amazing.
All this stuff.
So I was wondering, like, are you going to recreate that so we have like a visual for that?
That'd be cool. I wish and maybe if I hadn't switched.
We had an animation person
here.
Yeah. Yeah, but,
maybe.
I know. I wish I mean, really, you were talking about the voice of God, and this is God. But straight up, like God used some really fantastic effects in these visions. There's not just people walking around. It's the sun and the moon, and it's these lightning radiating out of thrones and stuff like that. It's all the spectacles. And I know I was scared when I was hearing Ken's sermon on drama that he was going to take all of the things I was going to talk about because it was like
chances minuscule
because it was because God is so dramatic and all of these visions, they're all over the top and high budget productions, if you will.
It's fantastical even now to actually sit and think about those, like you were kind of laying them out and making you think, okay, now we do this, and then you can almost picture it like, wow, that really is still pretty amazing. Instead of sometimes when you read it, it's like, well, there's the throne and there was ruby and whatever lights, shining through, and well, here's the 24 elders. Ooh, elders sound old.
Yeah,
I don't think this is exciting in any way. No, I thought that.
Well, one thing I wish I had done, which this is what we're looking for. Like afterwards, I was like, I wish I had said it this way in the sermon, was really about the prodigal son. I wish I had put the father inside. Like, what if he woke up and he's just looking through a window? Because that would have maybe emphasized a little bit more about mise en scène and things that are blocking this or that, just type of putting more barriers between him and his son, and how he the father could have like run through those barriers or open the barriers, things like that, just to like really visually tell that story even better. That's the stuff I was thinking of later. That's why, when you're storyboarding your film, you try to do a second draft if you can. But, and one thing I was going to say too, you were talking about using visualization. I think that maybe it's just me, but I feel like whenever something is read to me, I visualize it. And I think maybe everybody does that, but I just think that not everybody pauses to think about what they saw and to like maybe even like write it down or list it, what they saw. And that's where I think that's like my real invitation is to pause and to really like visually put yourself as the filmmaker of those scenes, just so that you can experience them in a richer way.
Well, this afternoon we had lunch, Melanie and I and our newest summer intern, Emma Toll, had lunch together.
Emma.
Welcome, Emma. So if you see Emma around, make sure you welcome her as part of our summer team here at Whole Life Church. And we were, we're trying to get to know her a little bit better. And so, do you listen to podcasts? Of course, my question, it was like, nope. And it was like, yeah, movies. Yeah, movies. Okay. But really we found that her passion lies in reading and in books. And so the idea, and then Melanie mentioned, they were swapping book stories and then, the book is, hey, the book is always better than the movie, right? That's the thing. And then, but the part that makes me excited when we think about it in a different way, like you just said, is some people don't stop and think. Like if they're a reader, they have this picture in their mind and they do that. But if someone's not a reader or they process differently, your sermon really, I felt like, gave people permission to say it's okay to think about what this would look like and dream a little bit. Let God, speak to you through just what you see and what you process from what He's telling you. But putting it in that medium was just because I think sometimes we tend to think that, well, I don't know what this means. Because I don't even know. I did not go and look. I was gonna look up the chapter 4 and get the whole thing. So what is that story telling us in total? Do we know? Is it one of those Revelation things with the 24 elders and everything you were talking about? Is there Is there a point to that story? I mean, I'm sure there's a point to it. I'm sure there's a point to it. But
so to answer your question, yes.
Yes. So what's it about? Or is that hotly debated too because it's Revelation?
Most things in Revelation are pretty hotly debated. Do we want to take the time in this podcast to fully unpack that, or
no, I don't know. Is there a Cliff Notes version, or is that hard to do because it's too deep?
I would want to probably spend a little bit more time. Stanley, do you want to dive into it?
No.
Okay. No, we don't have to. Read, but that, and we can leave it that way because honestly, that's part of, what did you get, what did you get from what Stanley talked about and the way that he described the words that are there on the pages of the Bible? And maybe what did that leave you with? And maybe it's not so much an answer to, is this a story that we understand, or is this all imagery? Is this in a dream? Is this meant to, is this prophecy? Mm-hmm. And, what exactly are we looking at here? And that's why I was just wondering if that was, or what made you choose that piece of the story. Was it just the descriptive parts that helped?
Yeah, the descriptive parts and it's a part that's nonverbal, and I also didn't want to wildly interpret what scholars had interpreted about Revelation, and so I felt like I was fairly safe with just doing just this little sliver without stepping on any toes. And I can't remember if I said it live or not, but I know that typically water, crystal clear water, would represent people and maybe pure people, whereas I interpret it, I took a very modern filmmaker stance on it of saying, well, mirrors are used for this because they described it as like crystal clear. So I imagined it immediately as a mirror, even though it doesn't say a mirror lake. I just went ahead and took my creative license and interpreted it that way. And so I felt like that was as dangerous as I wanted to get with that interpretation, because there are quite a few scholars that would probably maybe even disagree with some of the other assumptions that I made about it. But I was more or less going for, what's the vibe that we're getting off of this? Is that they're in heaven, we're invited. There's this very powerful ruby-skinned being that has lightning radiating out of their throne, and they're surrounded by 24 elders, and they sit on this pure lake that's reflective and basically has nothing to hide. He's bathed in light, and there's reflections all around him. So, and that was kind of just the vibe. I'm just trying to set up the scene, I guess, before anything else.
I think it's interesting, that particular passage, if you're wanting to talk about it a little bit, if it comes right after the message to the 7 churches, so feel free to go back to watch my 7 churches of Revelation. And one of the churches has an open door. It says, behold, I have an open door. But to Stanley's point, what's happening is John's being invited. The door is opened into heaven. The door is open. He's invited to come in and take a peek and see what's going on as this revelation of God begins.
That's cool. No, I mean, it definitely felt, majestic. It felt larger than life, not of this world. And maybe that's the point, is there's the awe of it.
I think one of the interesting things to think about let's go ahead and put a little context on this. So John the Revelator has this vision, but let's go ahead and say that John had been given a vision of our modern times. Let's just say that doors open, he gets to look. How do you think John describes vehicles? How do you think he describes airplanes? How do you think that he describes a modern city? We take a lot of our context for granted because we've grown up with it. And I remember one of the shocking things for me as a new parent was to realize that my child, who was beginning to be a toddler, did not have depth perception in the same way that I had it, that it was something that was acquired and learned, and that there's just a certain amount of perspective. And so I think the reason I bring that up is I think it's important, from a visual standpoint to think that you can only describe what you have words for.
Mm-hmm.
And as a filmmaker, as a visual artist, you can really only describe using the language and what you understand. And so I have to think, you know, however advanced we are right now, heaven's got to be a whole nother experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's when you hear John using words, I saw something like this and like that, it's important for us to understand that he's just trying to put words onto something that maybe he doesn't even really have the vocabulary to explain. And so the best he can say is, well, it's kind of like this. Imagine a sea made of glass.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think that, you know, to quote from our, you know, go back a week or two to The Art of Music, I can only, you know, mercy me, I can only imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Your imagination, you know, what heaven really is, what God appears like. John did his best to describe it. And that's one of the things I actually enjoy about filmmaking. The
Mm-hmm.
book is always better than the film, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the film will often fill out things that make the book in some ways feel more complete. And sometimes you struggle a little bit because if you've read the book, you had an imagination of what that person looked like or how they, their mannerisms, and then the actor has their visualization of what that person looked like, you know, or not what they look, but their mannerisms and whatnot. And so there's something.
Yeah, and I think with Revelation, unfortunately, we're not actually seeing it. We're seeing a description of what someone saw. So it's almost like a reverse screenplay, if you will. So that's where I'm like a little bit jealous sometimes of like, man, I wish this could have been recorded some way to just literally all have us look at it. But then, you know, we get a pretty good description though of everything that's happening. I think there was a question that came in about the colors of the skin that Atara asked me during the Q&A, and the fact that there's a green light or halo around this person on the throne and their skin's made of red, is those are opposite colors on the color spectrum on the color wheel. And that usually means that they will basically draw your attention to it, and if they're next to each other, they'll almost like vibrate because you're seeing your eye is like trying to figure out which one should I look at. And so that's why I think maybe that's even why that scene starts there, is just starting with the most contrasted thing and just starting there and
so
moving out
maybe
from there.
also go to later on in Revelation, it's around the beginning, the end, the Alpha, the Omega. And so there's the
all sides. And that's what I was thinking with the rainbow, is also all colors. I'm all of it type of thing.
Well, when it comes to Revelation, I think there's plenty to unpack or try to figure out what might go. But you know, at the very basic of it, though, the trip through that and realizing how intentional. The funny part is how intentional are filmmakers. And the craft and the thought that they're putting into this, and how are people going to naturally perceive this? And then I wonder, did God, through this revelation to John, I mean, was it like, well, this is kind of what it is, but I'm not going to show you everything because, you know, so like this seems pretty fantastical, pretty grand scale. And I just wonder if God's just kind of chuckling, like, these guys are talking about this, but they have no clue. You know, 24 elders, wait till we bust out the 199 that are back, you know, or whatever it is. The things that they don't know about. Yeah, right.
So much production value.
I think we better stick with 24.
We probably shouldn't change numbers. But that's totally.
But I was going to say the intentionality of a filmmaker, and I said in the sermon, where there's times where you're looking at stuff or the teacher's telling you something and you're like, come on. But then when you go out to make your own film, it really is, it takes a lot. It takes a team of people. There's so much planning. There's, you know, one shot might take hours to get right. And so it's very intentional. And that's why I think, you know, like God really intended all of this. None of this was an accident that we're seeing in Revelation, or we're hearing about John seeing in Revelation. It's like none of this is an accident. This is all very much on purpose. So that's, I think, like, hey, we need to really dive deep into what it is or what it looks like, how it makes us feel.
Yeah, Stanley and I were talking on Friday about that intentionality, and I was thinking about when I was in college, I took a fiction writing class, and one of the assignments was everyone read your piece, and you had to sit in a corner and you couldn't say anything while everyone discussed what you meant by what you wrote. And so Stanley has that experience also with the films that he's made, with people, adding things in or noticing things that he didn't intend.
Yeah, like someone sent me a whole sermon that a certain group made about one of our church retreat videos, and I was like, wow, this is really deep. This is like a lot of really deep reading into what was happening. And I'm sad to say that about myself that I think that they thought about it more than I did.
Which video was it?
It was the Adventist Alexa, the Ellen video that someone sent me a whole sermon on it. And I was like, wow.
A sermon that someone actually preached to a congregation.
To a congregation.
About your video.
About my video. Where they used my video as the centerpiece of their sermon about how wrong it was.
But does that make your video, that's practically elevating it to scripture if they used it as the source for that.
I was complimented. I was like, wow. I'm glad I incited this conversation.
So the sermon was they didn't care for the video.
Yep.
Oh.
Yeah. So a little bit of a negative sermon about it. But
as long as people are talking about you, right?
That's right. One way or another, I don't know. It may seem crazy, but I just feel like, hey, in starting conversations one way or the other, even if it wasn't my intent, I'm just glad conversations are happening.
I wonder if that's what God thinks too. That is not what I meant, but you know what? You're all talking about it, so continue on.
Well, speaking of conversations that were happening, and this wasn't a plant that I know of, but our first person is Nate.
Okay.
So I'm pretty sure
I know that, Nate.
Nate, you should have 10 more minutes before you get to work. So we're getting to your question first, just so in case you have to go in before we get to the end.
We have more than one Nate at our church.
Do we? Oh, that's right. We do. That's right. We do. And maybe it's the other Nate.
Well, and I know both of them listen to our podcast.
I know.
Okay. So this one Nate came up and told me that they put a question in. So
then we know which Nate it is. Then
Stanley was
educated guess about which Nate it is.
All right. Well, here we go. Whichever Nate you might be. What a great way to see how art can be shown in movies. Do you think God likes to use visuals in storytelling because we humans relate to it, and by doing so, have that critical thought?
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a large part of our brain that's dedicated to vision, and of course, we are designed to have two eyes and be able to see things with depth and visuals. And I think it is an interesting thing because it's just why did God always do visions and dreams? Why wasn't it people talking? Why wasn't it? Yeah. Why was it always visions? But I think that I really do think that it does engage us in a visual way and it forces us to think, and to put it into words is a whole process. And so I think that Nate is onto something that, it does, cause us to think.
I think it's interesting that we think maybe God is visual because God knows that we're visual people and this is how our brains work. But then on the other side, it's maybe people were created to be visual, and it's the other way around.
Yeah. No, and
that's a really good point.
I love the fact that Stanley was speaking about different movies that people like. What movie? What was the question? What movie?
Non-Christian movie that you had seen? You.
Yeah, that impacted. And we did. I'm just real quick. We had a ton of people. Captain America, Winter Soldier. We had Regarding Henry. The chat was full of different. Never Cry Wolf.
I don't know if I've seen that one.
That was from Nashville, Tim.
Oh, you haven't seen that one? That's a good one.
He said, said
that's based on a book, but it actually is. I thought it was as good as the book.
I saw God in the wilds of Alaska and Canada, and being reminded of what's important in this life that God has given us. And I was like, wow, there was. So now I'm like, okay, I haven't seen Winter Soldier. Probably need to circle that.
Well, Winter
one.
Soldier is one of the top 3 Marvel films, in my opinion.
So regarding Henry, so I'm like, I think I've got some movie watching to do.
That's a story about redemption. Ultimately, the main character has been, brainwashed, and it's through friendship and, brotherly love that he is able to heal himself. So I guess I could see, how they could get Winter Soldier, Captain America and Winter Soldier, get some of those vibes.
Cool. All right. We had an email from Randy Robertson who said, hello, podcast team and Stanley. See?
Yay.
Okay. Right away, getting a little shout out. Over the course of the current sermon series, a recurring thought that I have had and that I have heard in the questions of others is about sacred versus secular, religious versus worldly. This question again comes to mind with today's sermon by Stanley, in parentheses, great job, Stanley.
Thank you.
Exclamation point. Movies being a modern art form, an extension of sorts of theater, brings this question clearly to the forefront. What, in any given art form, differentiates a sacred work from a secular work, a religious versus worldly work?
I have a lot of thoughts on this, so I'll try to narrow it down, but I really, I might be paraphrasing this, but C.S. Lewis had this great quote about how we need more Christians making literature, not more Christian writers. And to me, what that means is that what we need are more people of morals making content, or as we call it today, content, but creating these things, because I think that, in answer to that question, the difference between secular and religious sometimes is just the intent of the artist, or maybe more, in a more brutal way, the intent of the marketing team. And is sometimes the biggest difference between secular and religious, because there's a lot of films that really hit a lot of very Christian themes that are, an action film, or maybe don't necessarily, or maybe even films that glorify violence still might have a good lesson at the end of the day. But I think, in my mind, that's the delineator, is artist's intent about whether or not it's religious or secular.
Well, Stanley, you were talking about one of the things that you took out of your sermon manuscript that I thought was really interesting is the formula that goes into making quote unquote Christian films.
Yeah. Well, so there's a Hollywood formula because to writing and to story structure, because Hollywood's very risk adverse, and every film is kind of like gambling, where you don't know if people are going to enjoy it or not. But as film schools developed and we got more and more refined as to what a story was, as people were trying to study it to make money ultimately. But there's and most recently, in the early 2000s, I think a book came out called Save the Cat, which basically made filmmaking a paint by numbers as far as the script goes. And it reduces it down to 15 points. And every time I've submitted a script, they're like, did you read Save the Cat? This has got to happen on this page. It's like literally down to the minute, like what's supposed to happen when. But when you look at the way Jesus told stories, it actually follows the same exact method of storytelling. If you reduce it down to the main 5 of those 15 points, it's exactly, you could lay it right on. You could lay parables right on top. You could lay the story of the Bible right on top, and it would all fit without even rearranging anything. And so it's not that Jesus knew the Hollywood method. It's that Hollywood studied the Jesus method, if you will, of storytelling, among other storytellers, Shakespeare and other stories. And so, am I saying something troubling?
Maybe they need to study it a little harder.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, maybe a little bit.
I think one of the things I'd want to add to what you're saying, Stanley, is I think it goes beyond just what the intent of the artist was. I think it goes to what it does to the person who's seen it when we talk about visual arts, and what it does inside that person. My wife and I don't always enjoy the same kind of movies. And a movie that will leave her really bothered will leave me really inspired. And we have. I don't want to make it sound like we like a lot of the same things, but there's I think about one of the movies that I'll always tear up in is Saving Private Ryan, right? For me, at the end when he comes to the grave and he's
was it enough?
Spoiler alert. I hope.
It was worth it.
Yeah, I hope it was worth it. You talk about themes of redemption, about laying down your life, not for somebody that you don't even know that they're going to really make their life worth something. Because at the end of the, near one of the last scenes is Tom Hanks' character is in the, process of dying. He said, make it count, basically was, do something with your life. And, I think about, Rochelle will never watch that movie because it's
violent.
It's violent. It is over the top. Especially those first couple scenes, and yet it really, touched me in some deep places and made me really evaluate, some things spiritually as well for myself. And so I think it's really wrong to tell my wife, well, because this has deep meaning for me, then you need to watch it because, because it might be traumatic for her to do that. And so, it's one of the reasons why I tend to be a little bit careful about saying movies and things like that in church. And even on this podcast, I like sitting here thinking, do I even want to say that,
right.
Because I don't want that to be a license for somebody to go watch this movie and you're like, and not only just be offended, but it actually be hurtful to your experience. That's, and yet we also do want to talk about the things that we find meaning in, because maybe somebody else will find some meaning too. Yeah. But the point I guess I would make to people is just because it's a Christian movie doesn't make it a good movie. and I'm not talking from an artist standpoint either. I'm just talking about it doesn't mean that it's okay and that everything's good. And, and I think we ought to be thoughtful. And that's the other part for me that people say, well, don't watch this. I like to tell people, when you watch something, do more than be a consumer. Think about what the messages are in there. What are they trying to say to you? How are they trying to influence you? There's no doubt that art is created to influence. There's just, you're an artist.
Yeah,
you're putting a message out there. And we sometimes, I kind of often look at like when people talk about the news and they take it as if the news is there to truly be informative. The news is there to make money for a company. That's what it's there to do. And as somebody who's worked in it, I'm here to tell you, I don't care whether you're Fox, CNN, MSNBC, your newscast is there to make money for some company somewhere. And they may have different targeted audiences, but they're trying to make money. And whenever artists make art, they're doing it to make a point and to say something. And when you just take it as just pure entertainment and don't think about it, I think you're doing a disservice to the artist, and I think you're doing a disservice to yourself.
Well, what I was going to say too is that early Hollywood was run by a lot of people that were Jewish, and they had a moral code that they were running the Hollywood with, where they were trying to keep the films, they were like, no excessive swearing. You couldn't show infidelity in a marriage. There was like all these rules that they had in place. But as filmmaking became democratized and it became cheaper and easier to make, and there were more film schools, that's when they lost control and the moral code just went whoosh, and the rating board came through. And so there is something to be said about it's not that every early film was a Christian film or a Jewish film, if you will, but it was that, it was a little bit easier to recommend a film back then than it is now. But I think there's also something to be said about what happened too is an almost soft segregation within film of this is now a Christian film and it's put into a separate box. It's put into a separate line on Netflix, if you will. There's this film, this genre of film, and then here's the faith-based films. And I think part of me is kind of sad about that box, just because I don't want anyone to just automatically skip that line on Netflix, if you will, and that's why I'm like, man, I'd love to make a film that didn't get segregated into this Christian film, but could still impact people. God could still work through it. And that's kind of one of my roundabout way of bringing it back to, is this secular, is this religious? But I'd like it to be religious, but considered secular, if that makes sense.
Well, and I think we see that in music too.
Yeah.
One of my favorite bands, Switchfoot, started out as a Christian band. I mean, they won quite a few Dove Awards and different things in their early existence. And then once their contract was up, they're like, no, we can do this ourselves. We can do it cheaper. We can control the music. We can decide what we want to create. I just so happened to, through another friend, have had a chance to meet Jerome, the keys and guitar player who's been with the band for, quite a few years. And so he's kind of told us personally about this. Like, we just decided that we could reach more people once they said, no, we're not a Christian band, even though they are.
They're Christian artists.
Jerome,
are artists that are Christian.
Jerome went to La Sierra Academy. I mean, the idea that you have to, which is odd, like you're saying this, I don't want to be in this category, but honestly, their greatest success came after they just said, you know what, we're going to still write and play and sing songs that make people think and make people feel and to talk about God. But we're going to do it as a secular band, and they've reached way more people. They've had way more success, and I think that's a legitimate categorization, because the follow-up question was, is that categorization just a tool that we use as humans to maybe more easily compartmentalize our life so that we create an in-group or out-group parameter that allows us to have our religious self and our worldly self and the associated benefits of each, which I think the answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah. Maybe segregation is too harsh of a word that I use, but I definitely feel like it's or relegated, if you will, over to this separate channel, because there's a lot of Christian music I like, but I still like, Led Zeppelin sometimes, or hearing somebody, some modern pop songs or whatever. My own Spotify list is a blend. And so that's kind of like, go on the radio and you're picking by genre, and I don't know. Part of me, like the being relegated to this other channel, does that limit people, I guess, to discovering you, or is it like, hey, it's here all the time, so maybe we're discovered more often? I don't know.
I think sometimes something that is intentionally faith-based and shows up in a faith-based category, and I make a rationalization here. It's almost like an indicator. This is the bubble you're stepping into. This is the narrative, and I think that sometimes faith-based films are more damaging because of the theology that they often promote, the reductionist approach to the complexities of living, the hubris that comes with a story in which, the Christians are always the smartest and the best, and they always win, and everybody else is stupid, and and they will fall, and all you have to do is pray, and then all of this is going to happen. I think that theology, a lot of times, is potentially more damaging than a secular story of good versus evil.
Yeah, so there's like how there's a formula for films in Hollywood, there's a formula for Christian films in Hollywood too, because I have pitched my scripts to Christian producers, and they have turned it back saying, here's what you need to add. Every Christian film we make must have this in it, which is someone must pray. They must receive a miracle yes answer, and someone must convert to Christianity within the film. as if that's the end all be all goal of converting to Christianity. And it's a little bit frustrating because you're like, oh, you know, like I just feel like there's a lot of great stories out there that can point to God that don't have to follow those specific parameters. And it's the whole risk adverse thing. And I don't really blame them. And I think, but it is frustrating for people that pray and don't get their miracle yes from God, because sometimes God, he knows better, and it's a no or a wait, hold on. We'll get to it, you know, you'll get to it type of thing. And that's a part that, like Melanie says, sometimes it can be a little bit damaging having that bubble. And by putting it in that category, people automatically take it as this is what Christianity is.
And it's inferior.
And a lot of the films aren't as good, whatever, but it's like, I make indie films, so my films are probably in that same genre of not as good, but which is fine. But it's the whole like this over here is what's accurate to Christianity. Here you are, and it's like it's dangerous if they're wrong. Then it's more damaging than a Fast and Furious film.
But who's Christianity? That's always my issue is
who's Christianity, right?
Because I can agree with, man, I have no problem seeing somebody praying. I have no problem seeing somebody having a prayer answered. But when it's framed with the idea that this is the good life, because once this is who you become, and we see that conversion story, well, then, you know, it's easy street from there on out, and that's the formula. Like the movie formula becomes the life formula, and that's just not accurate. I don't know of anyone whose life is that follows that or has followed that trajectory. Whereas also, I think if your film does not carry that baggage with it, someone is going to be more willing to give it a try if there's something that's interesting, whether that's artwork, whether that's your tagline, whether that's your trailer that was done really well, but you put every last, it's like Hollywood, you put every last scene, gag, and everything, and then like, this is a great movie. Well, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, depending on that. But
and I also want to be careful too, because I just want to say some people certainly have been impacted in a very positive way by Christian films.
Sure.
The movie I Can Only Imagine, you guys talked about that song earlier. Great film. I highly recommend it. A lot of people like, I forget what it was, but my wife was reading a biography about someone who was very jaded in Hollywood, and their boyfriend became a Christian after watching God's Not Dead. You know, and it's like, oh, okay, well, these movies are doing work. And somehow, you know, the Spirit led this gentleman to just try, like, I'm just going to watch this. And I think he was going to watch it to make fun of it, but then it ended up having an impact on him. So it's like, hey, you know what? I don't like the segregation, but sometimes it works. Sometimes it works.
God can do anything he wants. I'm convinced at this point in my life that if he wants to do it, he will.
God will do it.
That's it.
That's the real thing.
Well, again, if you missed the message, you really should go and watch and get this perspective that you can only get from someone who has that filmmaker's eye and thought process to see that meaning, and to maybe the next time you read scripture from someplace else and give it another look or another thought from a different perspective, it may change the way you see some things, or just add to your personal time with God. So this week upcoming, it is the Art of Worship, and this is architecture.
Architecture, yes.
Ooh, and do we know who? It's Ken preaching.
Ken's
right?
preaching. Mm-hmm.
And what are our? Do we have any big surprises? Any?
Well, we're gonna play with some atmospheric. Well, that sounds really ominous. But we're gonna play a little bit. We're gonna hear from an architect and potentially an interior designer about the impact of space, and I think we might experience some changes in space and talk about what that feels like.
We're going to raise the roof, metaphorically.
I live with an interior designer, so this could be fun. Yeah. That's cool. All right, guys, that is it for us this week. Stanley, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Everyone that comes to preach here has to do double duty on Saturday in the first place, which is kind of a big ask. And then secondly, then it's like, hey, can you show up on Tuesday? And then today Ken had meetings. And so, hey, can you come come and then come back for the podcast. So we appreciate you being here and taking your time and for your message. And so do go ahead, wholelife.church, right there on the front page. About a half a scroll will bring you to Stanley's message and the Q&A that happened with Atara afterwards. And of course, every message is updated there every week. Speaking of grace, also, you can catch the message if it's just on the run. You can swipe up in today's show notes. There's a link right there that'll take you to that show, which happens every Tuesday, and you can catch Stanley's message that way. And one more thing. Someone the other day asked me about why don't we do transcription? Well, we are going to be doing transcription. We have a new program that's going to be taking care of that for us. But if you listen on Apple Podcasts, let me just let you know now that if you open up to today's show and you have the show open and you listen to it, you can use on the lower left-hand corner, there's a little square box with 2 quotation marks. And if you do that, the words of the transcript come right up on your screen. That's cool. Nothing we've done. Apple has started to do that for all their podcasts. So the transcription is right there. And if you leave the screen on while the message is happening, the words come right up on the screen. Sweet. So if you want to do that, that's an easy way to do it. So for those that have been asking for transcription, if you are an Apple user, you already have that. And I believe it's on the desktop version as well. So there you go. But soon the transcription will be available for all episodes. We'll have those available by website, and the remaining, we went with the provider and we are currently locked out of the account. So I can't even get in. So
that's a great sign.
I know, right? But it is coming, and it was Ken's choice. It wasn't mine. He's not here to defend himself.
He's not here to defend himself. Oh,
that was wrong.
wow.
It's going to be good though. We did see it in action before we had problems, and so I'm sure we'll get those squared away. So
are they sponsoring this podcast?
They are not. They should be. They should be, because I've been locked out for a couple of weeks. So maybe I'll ask them about a sponsorship. If you'd like to sponsor the show, 407-965-1607. And we might do it for Uber Eats. I'm just saying, just
deliver some
every Tuesday at 1:30 or 1 o'clock. We could do it while we eat. No, probably not. Probably should be
a lot of lip smacking.
A lot of lip smacking. That's no good for nobody. Okay. Yeah. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this week. Thanks for listening, and as always, have a great week.